The eviction notice was not delivered on paper. It came in the form of 3 hard knocks on the cabin door and the grim face of Hiram Vance, her deceased husband's older brother. He stood on her threshold on October 12th, 1876, a man whose heart seemed as barren as the windswept Dakota prairie that stretched out behind him. He did not remove his hat. He did not offer a word of condolence for his brother, Thomas, who had been buried only a month prior, taken by a sudden fever that had swept through Providence Creek like a phantom thief. "Elara," he began, his voice flat and devoid of warmth, "the family has decided. The cabin belongs to the Vance bloodline. Thomas is gone. You are not a Vance." His words were stones, each one cast with deliberate, crushing weight. He was technically correct, according to the unwritten laws of patriarchal inheritance that governed their small, isolated community. She was a wife, and now a widow, but she had brought no land and no significant dowry to the marriage. Her claim, in his eyes and the eyes of the town elders he represented, had died with her husband. She stood there, a slight figure framed in the doorway of the home she had shared with Thomas for 2 years. The scent of pine from the log walls and the faint aroma of the dried herbs hanging from the rafters filled her senses, a cruel reminder of a life that was being systematically erased. She was 17 years old. "Where am I to go, Hiram?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. She would not give him the satisfaction of tears. She had wept enough over Thomas's grave. This was a different kind of grief, a cold and practical terror that demanded clarity, not sorrow. "That is not the family's concern," he stated, his gaze shifting uncomfortably toward the horizon, as if her directness was an affront. "Reverend Miller has offered you a bed in the church attic for a fortnight. After that, you must make your own way, perhaps back to whatever family you have left in the East." He knew perfectly well she had no one. Her parents had perished from cholera on the wagon journey west 6 years earlier. Her only living relative, a grandfather, had passed 2 winters ago, leaving her with nothing but a chest of his strange books and a head full of his even stranger ideas. She was an orphan, a widow, and now a pauper. The town of Providence Creek, with its 30-odd structures and 150 souls, had effectively cast her out. The unspoken truth hung in the air. A lone woman without a male protector was a burden, an anomaly they did not wish to accommodate. Winter was coming, a fact announced by the sharp, biting edge of the morning wind and the gray, heavy belly of the clouds massing in the northwest. To be without a roof in this part of the country after October was not merely an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. Hiram gave a curt nod, his business concluded. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt, leaving her alone with the echo of his verdict. She had 2 weeks, 14 days to either flee a land she had nowhere to flee to, or to devise a means of survival in the face of a community that had turned its back and a winter that promised no mercy. She stood in the doorway until his figure was a small speck against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Then she stepped back inside and quietly closed the door on the life she had lost. For 2 days, Elara moved in a fog of methodical grief, packing her meager belongings into a single wooden trunk. She took her husband's tools, a few pots and pans, a quilt her mother had made, and the small, heavy chest filled with her grandfather's books. These books were not the usual collection of Bibles and almanacs. They were filled with detailed diagrams of Roman aqueducts, sketches of ancient European hill forts, and handwritten notes on everything from soil composition to the principles of the arch. Her grandfather had been an engineer in England before immigrating, a man fascinated by old ways and natural laws, and he had poured his knowledge into her as if she were his last, most important project. On the 3rd day, as she sorted through a pile of his loose schematics, her eyes fell upon a series of drawings she had studied with him years ago. He had called it a wallapini, an Aymara word for a place of warmth. It was an underground greenhouse, a pit dug into the earth with a glazed roof, designed to use the planet's own thermal mass to grow crops in the harsh climate of the Andes. Beside it were his own modifications, adapting the principle not for agriculture but for human habitation. He called it a winter cellar, or a stone dugout. He had sketched cross-sections showing how the earth itself, once you dug below the frost line, maintained a near-constant temperature, a reservoir of the previous summer's warmth. "The earth is a better blanket than any quilt, my girl," he used to say, his voice thick with a Yorkshire accent. "And stone is a better wall than any log." A spark ignited within her, a flicker of fierce, determined hope. The town saw her as a helpless waif to be pitied and discarded. They saw the prairie as a flat, empty grave waiting to claim the unprepared, but her grandfather had taught her to see differently. He had taught her to read the land, to understand its hidden strengths. She looked out the cabin window not at an empty expanse, but at a resource. The earth beneath her feet was not just dirt, it was shelter. The countless stones littering the fields were not just obstacles, they were bricks. She remembered a small plot of land at the far edge of the township, a quarter-acre of rocky, sloping ground that everyone considered useless. It had been part of a larger homestead that was abandoned years ago, and the town council had declared it common land, fit for nothing but grazing the occasional stray goat. It was undesirable, forgotten, and, most importantly, unclaimed. It sat on a south-facing slope, perfect for maximizing exposure to the low winter sun. The ground there was thick with the very fieldstones she would need. Her plan, audacious and born of pure desperation, began to form. She would not beg. She would not flee. She would build. She would dig her home out of the very earth they had abandoned her to. Armed with this nascent idea, she marched to the town hall, a small clapboard building that also served as the general store and post office. She needed the council's permission to occupy the worthless land, a formality she hoped would be granted out of pity or, more likely, a desire to be rid of her. The council consisted of 3 men: Reverend Miller, a portly man whose piety was often overshadowed by his love of gossip; Silas Croft, the blacksmith, a man of immense physical strength and limited imagination; and his brother, Jedediah Croft, the owner of the general store and the de facto mayor of Providence Creek. Jedediah was a man who measured the world in dollars and cents, a staunch believer in convention, and the most influential voice in the town. It was he she truly had to convince. They were gathered around the pot-bellied stove in the center of the store when she entered. The smell of sawdust, cured meats, and Jedediah's cheap cigars filled the air. He looked up from his ledger, his eyes narrowing slightly at her presence. "Mistress Vance," he said, his tone suggesting her interruption was an inconvenience. "We had heard you were preparing to leave us." "I have no intention of leaving," Alara stated, her voice clear and carrying across the room. "I have come to petition the council. I wish for permission to build a temporary shelter on the old Morrison plot, the quarter-acre of fallow land to the south." Reverend Miller shifted in his seat, a look of genuine concern on his face. "My dear child, there is nothing there. It is exposed, rocky ground. Winter is but a few weeks away. A sod house, perhaps, but there is no time to cut the sod before the ground freezes solid. A log shelter? There is no good timber nearby." "It will not be a sod house or a log shelter," Alara explained, keeping her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. "I intend to dig a cellar, a stone-lined dugout, built into the south-facing slope. It will be mostly underground." A thick silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackle of the stove. Silas Croft, the blacksmith, let out a short, barking laugh. "A hole in the ground? You mean to live like a badger, girl?" Jedediah Croft removed the cigar from his mouth, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked at her as a man might look at a foolish child. "Mistress Vance, with all due respect to your recent hardship," he began, his condescension a palpable force, "what you propose is absurd. People do not live in holes in the ground. We are civilized folk. We build proper houses with timber frames and good Christian foundations. A damp, dark cellar is a place for storing potatoes, not for a person to survive a Dakota winter. You will catch your death of consumption before the first real blizzard." "With respect, Mr. Croft," Alara countered, her gaze unwavering, "my design is not for a simple root cellar. It is based on principles of thermal mass. The earth below the frost line maintains a stable temperature, roughly 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. By digging down and using the earth to insulate the walls, the structure will retain heat. The stone lining will absorb warmth from a small stove in the sun, radiating it back throughout the day and night. It will be warmer and require less firewood than any log cabin in this town, including your own." Her technical explanation only seemed to deepen their amusement. Jedediah leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger on his ledger. "Thermal mass? These are fancy words, Mistress Vance. Where did a young woman like you learn such things?" "My grandfather was an engineer. He taught me." "Ah, yes, the old man with the peculiar books," Jedediah said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Eccentricity, I believe, was his defining characteristic. Listen to me, child. We men have been building on this prairie for 20 years. We know what works. A deep foundation, thick log walls, a steep pitched roof to shed the snow. That is how you survive. Digging a pit and covering it with dirt is a recipe for being buried alive in a cold, muddy grave. The land is worthless, Alara pressed, refusing to be drawn into an argument about her grandfather. Grant me its use, and I will be no one's burden. Deny me, and you are leaving me to perish. Is that the council's wish? Her directness shamed them into a corner. Reverend Miller cleared his throat. Of course not, child. We are not without charity. The plot is of no use to anyone. If you are insistent on this folly, we will not stand in your way. Jedediah Croft sighed, a picture of put-upon magnanimity. Very well, you may have your pit, but the council absolves itself of all responsibility. When you come to us in a month, shivering and sick, do not say you were not warned. We have offered you the sensible path. You have chosen the badger's way. He smiled at his own wit, and Silas chuckled beside him. Permission was granted. The cost of their approval was her dignity. Alara nodded once, turned, and walked out of the store, their condescending smirks burning into her back. She had the land. She had the knowledge. What she needed now was time, and every ounce of strength she possessed. The race against winter had begun. On the morning of October 15th, 1876, Alara stood on the south-facing slope of the Morrison plot. The air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of dry grass and impending snow. She held a ball of twine, a measuring tape, and 4 wooden stakes her husband had sharpened for a fence he never built. Using the sun's position to orient herself, she marked out a rectangle on the sloping ground. It was to be 14 feet wide, east to west, and 20 feet long, north to south, with the northernmost wall cut directly into the deepest part of the hillside. This orientation would shield the structure from the brutal north winds and allow the longest southern wall to be exposed, eventually, to the low winter sun. She spent the first 3 days not digging, but preparing. She walked the quarter acre, gathering the most suitable fieldstones, sorting them by size and shape. She needed large, relatively flat stones for the foundation courses, and a variety of smaller ones to fill the gaps. She stacked them in neat piles, her body quickly aching with the repetitive strain of lifting and carrying. The townspeople who passed on the distant cart track saw her toiling alone and shook their heads, whispering about the poor, mad widow Vance. Next, she acquired her tools. From her husband's collection, she had a sturdy spade and a pickaxe, but she needed a good wheelbarrow and a heavy-duty sledgehammer to break some of the larger rocks. She walked back to Jedediah Croft's general store with the last of her money clutched in her hand. It amounted to $27, the sum of her savings and the sale of a few of Thomas's less essential possessions. Croft sold her a second-hand wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel and a sledgehammer with a slightly splintered handle. The total came to $4.50. Be sure you get your money's worth, he said, a glint of mockery in his eye. It would be a shame to waste good coin on a grave. Alara ignored him, paid the man, and wrestled the heavy tools back to her plot of land. Those $4.50 represented the first and largest cash expenditure of her entire project. The excavation was the most grueling task. The topsoil was thin, giving way quickly to dense, clay-like earth studded with rocks. She began at the northern end, driving the pickaxe into the ground with rhythmic, jarring impacts that shuddered up her arms and into her shoulders. Then she would use the spade to pry the loosened earth and stones free, loading them into the wheelbarrow. The plan was not simply to discard the excavated dirt. Her grandfather's notes were clear. The displaced earth was a building material. She used it to create a thick, sloping berm around the east, west, and south sides of the pit, effectively extending the insulating embrace of the hillside around the entire structure. For 2 weeks, she worked from the first light of dawn until her muscles screamed in protest, and the evening chill drove her back to the temporary shelter of the church attic. Every shovelful of dirt was a victory. Every rock dislodged was a step closer to survival. She dug down, foot by agonizing foot, 4 feet, 5 feet. At 6 feet, the composition of the soil changed, becoming cooler and slightly damp to the touch. She had passed the frost line. Her grandfather had been right. The air at the bottom of the pit already felt different, stiller and strangely mild compared to the increasingly sharp wind at the surface. She continued until the northern end of the pit was 8 feet deep, sloping gently up to a depth of 6 feet at the southern end to facilitate drainage. With the pit dug, the stonework began. This was not brute force, but a craft of patience and geometry. She started the foundation by laying the largest, flattest stones directly on the compacted earth floor, creating a 2-foot wide base for the walls. Then she began the slow process of dry stacking. Each stone was chosen and placed with care, fitting it against its neighbors like a piece of a massive, irregular puzzle. She followed the cardinal rule of stonemasonry: 1 stone over 2 and 2 stones over 1, ensuring the vertical joints were never aligned, which gave the wall its strength. She built the north, east, and west walls directly against the earth, packing any small gaps between the stone and the soil with gravel and sand for drainage. The stone was not just a retaining wall, it was the critical component of her heating system. During the day, this immense mass of stone and earth would slowly absorb any heat generated inside. At night, it would just as slowly radiate that heat back into the living space, creating a remarkably stable internal temperature. It was a silent, tireless engine of heat exchange, powered by the basic laws of thermodynamics. The south-facing wall was different. It was not built against the earth, but stood freely, designed to be the primary interface with the outside world. This would be the wall with the door and, eventually, a small window. It was here that she would use mortar. She couldn't afford to buy cement, so she made her own lime mortar, another piece of her grandfather's old-world knowledge. She had purchased 3 bags of quicklime from Croft for $2. In a pit lined with wood, she carefully slaked the lime, adding water in a process that produced a hiss of steam and a tremendous amount of heat. After covering the pit and letting the lime putty mature for a week, she mixed it with sand and a small amount of water to create a strong, workable mortar. Using a trowel, she mortared the stones of the south wall together, creating a solid, airtight barrier against the wind. She left a carefully framed opening for a door and a small square aperture for a window. The door itself was a challenge. She had no money for milled lumber. Instead, she scavenged planks from the collapsed remains of the old Morrison homestead's barn a half-mile away. The wood was weathered but sound. She spent 2 days sawing the planks to size and fastening them together with salvaged nails, creating a heavy, solid door that fit snugly into its stone frame. By the 2nd week of November, the walls were complete. The structure was a stone-lined box set into the earth, open to the sky. The air inside was already noticeably warmer than the outside, the stone and earth acting as a massive windbreak. But the most critical piece was still missing: the roof. A conventional pitched roof would have been expensive and difficult for one person to build. Her grandfather's plans offered a more elegant solution: a reciprocal frame roof, also known as a mandala roof. It was a design where each rafter rests on the previous one, forming a strong, self-supporting spiral that required no central post. It was incredibly strong and could be built with shorter, more easily sourced timbers. She found her timber in a small aspen grove in a ravine a mile from her site. The trees were not thick enough for log cabin construction, which was why they had been ignored by the town's builders, but they were perfect for her needs. Using a 2-man crosscut saw, a tool that was pure misery to operate alone, she felled 6 straight, 8-inch thick aspen trees. She spent a full day just dragging the logs back to her building site, her body pushed to the absolute limit of its endurance. She notched the logs carefully according to the diagrams in her grandfather's book. Then came the difficult part: lifting them into place. The first rafter was angled from the top of the east wall to the top of the west wall. The second rested on the east wall in the midpoint of the first rafter. The third rested on the west wall in the midpoint of the second. She continued this pattern, wrestling each heavy log into position, until the final rafter locked the entire structure into a beautiful, interlocking spiral with a small opening in the center for a chimney. Over this sturdy wooden frame, she laid a layer of the salvaged barn planks. On top of the planks, she placed a layer of thick prairie sod she had painstakingly cut and saved before the ground froze, laying it grass side down. This created a layer of insulation and a medium for the final layer: the tons of excavated earth she had piled up. For 4 days, wheelbarrow load by wheelbarrow load, she moved the earth onto the roof, spreading it into a thick 2-foot layer that blended the structure almost seamlessly back into the hillside. The final step was to transplant living prairie sod, grass side up, onto the earthen roof. Come spring, her home would be covered in prairie flowers. Her final expenses were for a small cast-iron stovepipe and a single pane of glass for her small window, which cost her another $1.75. She built a small, efficient hearth and chimney in the northeast corner, using clay and stone, venting it through the opening in the roof. The stovepipe ensured a proper draw and kept the small space free of smoke. The total cost of her materials, the wheelbarrow, sledgehammer, lime, stovepipe, and glass, came to $8.25. She had $19.75 left to her name, a fortune she would need for flour, salt, and other provisions she could not make herself. On November 28th, with the first snowflakes of the season beginning to drift from a leaden sky, Alara Vance moved into her new home. From the outside, it was little more than a low mound of earth on the hillside, with a single sturdy door and a small glass eye set into its south-facing stone wall. But inside, it was a sanctuary. The air was cool but not cold, and utterly still. The silence was profound, the thick earthen walls muting the sound of the rising wind to a distant whisper. She lit a small, carefully managed fire in her hearth. The stones of the chimney and the back wall began to warm, and within an hour, a comfortable, radiant heat filled the 14 by 20-foot space. The temperature, she noted on a small thermometer she had kept from her husband, rose to a steady 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The town watched her move in with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Jedediah Croft openly predicted she would be frozen solid by Christmas. "The ground freezes, you see," he explained to the patrons in his store, gesturing with his cigar. "That hole will be an icebox. She has built her own tomb." The other men nodded in agreement, confident in their conventional wisdom, secure in their sturdy, drafty log cabins that required mountains of firewood to keep habitable. They did not understand the difference between the frozen topsoil and the deep, abiding warmth of the earth below. They saw a hole in the ground. They could not comprehend that she was living inside a battery, a massive reservoir of stored thermal energy. December arrived, and with it, the winter's true fury. The temperature began to plummet. The wind, a constant, scouring presence on the prairie, became a physical weapon, seeking out every crack and chink in the town's log houses. The daily conversation in Providence Creek turned to firewood. Men spent their days chopping and hauling, and their nights feeding their hungry, inefficient stoves. The stacks of cordwood, which had seemed so immense in October, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. In her subterranean home, Alara lived a life of quiet, frugal comfort. Her small fire required only a few logs a day to maintain the temperature. The stone walls and earthen roof, having absorbed the initial heat, now radiated it back constantly. The interior never dropped below 58 degrees, even on nights when the outside temperature fell to 10 below zero. She spent her days reading her grandfather's books, mending her clothes, and baking small loaves of bread on her hearth. The silence and solitude were her companions. Through her single pane of glass, she could see the snow piling up, the world turning into a stark landscape of white and gray. But inside her refuge, she was warm, she was safe, and she was at peace. On December 18, 1876, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple. The wind died down to an eerie calm. The old-timers in town looked to the northwest and felt a primal dread. This was no ordinary storm front. This was a blizzard, the likes of which had not been seen in a generation. The first flakes were small and hard, like pellets of sand. Within an hour, the world dissolved into a churning, horizontal vortex of white. The wind returned with a demonic howl, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. The great blizzard of 1876 had begun. For the people of Providence Creek, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The temperature dropped with terrifying speed. 0, 10 below, 20 below. The wind, gusting to over 60 miles per hour, drove the snow into every crack. It sifted under doors, through window frames, and even through the chinking between the logs of their cabins. Inside their homes, the temperature fell dramatically. Families huddled around their stoves, feeding them constantly, but the heat was sucked away as fast as it was generated. The walls of their cabins were bleeding warmth into the maelstrom outside. Alara, in her shelter, experienced the storm as a distant, muffled rage. The wind howled far above her earthen roof, the sound softened and made remote by the tons of soil and stone that separated her from its fury. The snow piled up, burying her home even more deeply, adding yet another layer of perfect insulation. Inside, her thermometer read a steady 60 degrees. She added one small log to the fire, put a kettle on for tea, and opened one of her grandfather's books on Roman engineering. While her neighbors fought a desperate, losing battle for survival, she sat in quiet warmth and read about the construction of the Pantheon. By the second day of the blizzard, the situation in Providence Creek had become critical. The temperature outside had dropped to 35 degrees below zero, with a wind chill that the human mind could scarcely comprehend. The town's firewood supplies were being consumed at a catastrophic rate. Silas Croft's cabin, one of the best built in town, was struggling to stay above 40 degrees. His children were bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces pale and their breath fogging in the air. Jedediah Croft's house, the largest in town, was also failing. Despite having 2 stoves burning at full capacity, the main room was barely freezing. He had run out of seasoned oak and was now burning green pine, which filled the house with smoke but provided little heat. His wife and 2 daughters were huddled in the kitchen, the warmest room, but they were shivering uncontrollably. The smug confidence had vanished from his face, replaced by a gnawing, unfamiliar fear. His proper house, his symbol of civilized success, was proving to be a fragile, inadequate defense against the true power of nature. He thought of the girl in her hole in the ground. He pictured her frozen, a grim monument to her own folly. The thought gave him no comfort now. By the morning of the 3rd day, tragedy struck. The family of a young farmer on the edge of town, the Abernathys, had run out of wood entirely. In a desperate attempt to reach a neighbor's woodpile, the father had become disoriented in the whiteout and had frozen to death less than 50 yards from his own door. His wife and 2 small children were found later, huddled together, having succumbed to the cold in their own home. The news, shouted from one besieged house to another during a brief lull in the wind, sent a shockwave of terror through the community. They were all running out of wood. They were all losing the battle against the cold. Their homes were not shelters. They were becoming tombs. It was then that Silas Croft, his face grim and etched with worry, bundled himself in every layer he owned and fought his way through the waist-deep snow to his brother's house. "Jedediah!" he roared over the wind, bursting through the door into the smoky, frigid interior. "We are dying! The Abernathys are gone! My children are shivering so hard their teeth are chattering. We have maybe half a day's wood left. What are we going to do?" Jedediah Croft looked at his brother, his own fear reflected in Silas's desperate eyes. All his certainty, all his conventional wisdom, had crumbled to dust. His ledger books and his profit margins were meaningless in the face of this elemental cold. There was no one to appeal to, no authority to consult. He was the authority, and he had been spectacularly, fatally wrong. And then a single, humbling thought pierced through his pride. The girl. The mad widow. The badger in her hole. "What about the Vance girl?" Silas asked, voicing the thought that had just bloomed in Jedediah's mind. "Her cellar." Jedediah's first instinct was to dismiss it. It was impossible. A damp hole. A grave. But what if it was not? What if her strange talk of thermal mass and earth insulation was true? The alternative was to stay here and freeze. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered now. "It's our only chance," Jedediah said, his voice hoarse. "It is our only possible chance." He looked at his wife and daughters, their faces blue with cold. "Gather everyone you can. Miller, the Hendersons, everyone. We go to her." The journey of the 20-odd townspeople who could still move was an epic of human misery. They tied ropes between them so as not to get separated in the blinding snow. They stumbled through drifts that were shoulder-high, the wind stealing their breath and freezing their exposed skin in moments. It was a desperate, primal pilgrimage from the failure of their own making to the hope of a solution they had mocked. Jedediah Croft, the town's proud leader, was at the front, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and a profound, gut-wrenching shame. They almost missed it. The shelter was so completely buried in snow that it was nearly invisible. Only the thin plume of smoke rising from the stovepipe, a beacon of impossible warmth, gave its location away. They clawed their way through the drift covering the door, their hands numb and clumsy. Silas Croft, with his blacksmith's strength, finally managed to pull the heavy wooden door open. The group tumbled inside, falling one after another into a world of impossible calm and warmth. The contrast was so profound it was disorienting. Outside was a roaring, frozen hell. Inside was a silent 60-degree sanctuary. A single lantern cast a gentle golden light over the space. A kettle was steaming softly on the hearth. And standing by the small fire, a book in her hand, was Alara Vance. She looked at the collection of half-frozen, terrified people who had collapsed onto her floor. She saw Jedediah Croft, his beard encrusted with ice, his face a mask of desperation and awe. She saw his wife and daughters huddled together and weeping with relief from the sudden, life-giving warmth. She saw Reverend Miller muttering prayers of thanks under his breath. She saw the faces of every person who had pitied her, scorned her, and warned her of her folly. Not one of them had lost a family member in a blizzard before. Not one of them had burned through their entire winter wood supply in 3 days. And not one of them, until this very moment, would have ever admitted they had been wrong. Alara looked at them, her expression unreadable. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not demand an apology. She did not gloat. Her vindication was not in words, but in the simple, undeniable fact of the warm air they were breathing. It was in the radiant heat coming from the stone walls. It was in the quiet, absolute triumph of forgotten knowledge over arrogant ignorance. She closed her book, marking her page. She walked over to the collection of shivering townspeople and spoke, her voice calm and even. "There is stew on the hearth, and the kettle is hot for tea. Come in, get warm." For 2 more days, as the great blizzard raged outside, the survivors of Providence Creek huddled in the shelter built by the 17-year-old girl they had cast out. They slept in shifts on the floor, sharing the blankets Alara provided. They ate her food and drank her tea. They listened in stunned silence to the muffled scream of the wind, safe within the embrace of the earth. Jedediah Croft sat near the wall, his hand resting on the cool, smooth stone, feeling the faint, deep warmth it held. He was not just feeling the heat, he was feeling the weight of his own profound, near-fatal foolishness. He had measured the world in timber and coin, while she had understood it in earth and stone. When the storm finally broke on the 5th day, the world was transformed. The sun shone on a landscape of immense, sculpted snowdrifts. The town of Providence Creek was half buried and silent. A survey of the damage revealed the full extent of the catastrophe. In addition to the Abernathy family, 7 other souls had perished in their homes, frozen solid in houses that had become their coffins. Nearly every family had lost livestock. The town's collective wood supply was gone. Without Alara's shelter, the death toll would have been far, far higher. The survivors emerged from the earthen mound into the blinding sunlight, blinking like newborns. They looked at their own cold, dead houses, and then back at the simple door set into the hillside. It was no longer a badger's hole or a mad girl's folly. It was the ark that had carried them through the flood. Alara Vance never left Providence Creek. She did not have to. The town, in its entirety, now revolved around her. The stone cellar became a temporary town hall, a place of warmth and counsel. That spring, under her direct and patient instruction, the men of the town began to build more shelters like hers, digging into the earth, learning the forgotten art of stone and soil. Jedediah Croft was her most diligent student. His arrogance replaced by a quiet, deep-seated reverence for the young woman who had saved his family. He never spoke of the days he had mocked her, but his deference and respect were a constant, unspoken apology. She had sought only to survive. In the end, she had become their teacher, their savior, the quiet, unshakable center of a community that had been forced to learn that the most profound wisdom is often not found in loud, confident pronouncements, but in the silent, steady strength of the earth itself, and in the courage of those who are brave enough to listen to its truths. Her victory was not loud, but it was absolute, as solid and enduring as the stone walls she had laid with her own 2 hands.